Hi, this is Deb Colling from Northwest College, and I want to share with you a quick tour of the architecture in Williamsburg, Virginia. The original House of Burgesses of Virginia sat in Jamestown from 1619 to 1704, but then the legislature moved to Williamsburg, and the first Capitol building in the colonies was built there. Later, 1780, when Thomas Jefferson was involved, the Commonwealth moved further inland to Richmond. So from 1704 to 1780, Williamsburg was the political, cultural, and educational center of Virginia. First, let me orient you to the state of Virginia. This is the Fry-Jefferson map, which was produced in the mid-18th century, and the Jefferson referred to in the title is Peter Jefferson, who helped produce it. He's the father of Thomas. Contemporary Virginia would fall roughly along these lines here and go out of our view on the left-hand side. But the area we're interested in is on this peninsula right here. It's the historic triangle because it includes Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg. So a lot of history and a lot of famous people were centered in this area. By the 20th century, Williamsburg was a sleepy little backwater. But interestingly enough, quite a few of the important historical buildings still existed or their foundations still existed. In 1926, Dr. Goodwin, who was the rector of the Burton Church in Williamsburg, shared his dream of wishing to restore these buildings and preserve them. And he got the support of John D. Rockefeller to put in a lot of money. Working together, they managed to work on about 85% of the 18th century capital's area. Contemporary Williamsburg, of course, is much bigger. And they preserved originally 88 structures and reconstructions. Today, you can visit Colonial Williamsburg. It became one of the first living history museums in America and became for the inspiration of many others around the country. And historic Williamsburg covers about 85% of the original Capitol area. We're going to look at a few famous buildings here, including the Capitol building, the palace that belonged to the royal governor, Burton Church, as well as many of the shops, trade centers, and houses that exist along this main street in Williamsburg. This slide gives you an idea of the work that the restorers had before them, because on the left hand here you see what the governor's palace looked like before restoration, and on the right hand side you see the after. This building was originally completed about 1720, but it was destroyed by fire in 1781. 7 royal governors lived here and 2 elected governors, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. Archaeologists and restoration experts were able to recreate the building by using the original foundation, using floor plans that have been created by Jefferson, and copperplate engravings that they found in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So this gives you an idea of how they create and approach a restoration like this. As was befitting to a royal governor appointed by the British king, the palace was a fairly elaborate building with beautiful grounds. Here's a contemporary description of what it looked like. This was written in 1724 by a professor from the College of William and Mary. From the church runs a street northward called Palace Street, at the other end of which stands the palace or governor's house, a magnificent structure built at the public expense, finished and beautified with gates, fine gardens, offices, walks, a fine canal, orchards, etc. This likewise has the ornamental addition of a good copula or lanthorn, illuminated, with most of the town, upon birthnights and other nights of occasional rejoicings. Notice these outbuildings here and here. We're going to talk more about those in a minute. Behind the governor's palace is the ballroom wing, and this was built probably around 1751 so the governor could have official entertainment and balls there. Over the door, too small for you to see in this picture, is the official coat of arms of King George II of England. The formal garden of the governor was the most elaborate in Williamsburg. Notice the trained fruit trees that run across the wall here so they'd have extra warmth and help them with their blooming. The beautifully trained formal garden here with boxwood hedges and trees all trimmed. And up here, a bowling green Remember those outbuildings I showed you earlier? Well, one of them was the kitchen. Colonial kitchens were a fire hazard, and so they were built in separate buildings from the main house. Covered dishes were used to keep food warm on its journey to the dining room, and the cooks used long-handled utensils to help them cook over the fire. They had brick floors to help prevent fires. The entrance hall to the governor's palace is paneled in black walnut with the royal coat of arms carved in oak over the fireplace. You may wonder how restorers knew that this is actually what it looked like. Well, throughout the 18th century, officials took official inventories of the contents of the house, and these records were kept and came down to us. Consequently, when you see an item like these muskets that are arranged in an elaborate sunburst on the ceiling, that's accurate. As a matter of fact, these are historic armaments which came from the Tower of London. Similarly, here we have handguns and swords that are put in elaborate decorative patterns. This is the formal supper room, and you can see evidence of the Chinese vogue which was popular in the mid and late 18th century in America. Notice, for instance, this pagoda-like pediment which is over the door. And this wallpaper is actually antique wallpaper which was hand-painted in China. Restorers found fragments of wallpaper and again references to the inventory which allowed them to recreate this. The parlor is a little less formal and was used by the governor and his family for entertaining guests at meals and for playing games. The first Capitol building was completed in 1705, and it's actually two separate buildings which are connected by an arcade that goes across. The building on the left side, also known as the West Wing, was the upper house. That's where the governor's council, the general court, and the colony secretary would be. On the other side is the House of Burgesses. This building was originally built without fireplaces in order to lessen the threat of fire. In fact, they forbade candles and pipes there. But the builders had to add fireplaces later in order to eliminate a problem they had with damp. And sure enough, the structure burned in 1747. Then they rebuilt it in 1753. It's in the second structure that Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. After the Capitol moved to Richmond, the West Wing was taken apart and sold for bricks, and the East burned again in 1832. Here we have an interior view of the House of Burgesses, the lower house, and that's the original speaker's seat that we have. Every 18th century Virginian of note served here: Washington, Jefferson, Lee, Henry, Mason, and more. This is a room that joins the two separate wings of the Capitol. It's located above the arched arcade, and this was the common meeting place where the lower house and the upper house could meet. This is a reconstruction of the Raleigh Tavern, which was probably the most famous hostelry in the 18th century. We can literally say Washington slept here. On several occasions, the Burgesses, the lower house, had to meet here after an irate governor dissolved them for the temerity of their actions. Eventually, in the mid-19th century, it burned down. The Apollo Room was a large meeting room in the Raleigh Tavern that would have been used for balls and banquets. For instance, this is where the House of Burgesses met in secret in 1774 and issued a call to the other colonies for the First Continental Congress. But a lot of business took place in the bar room, too. One of the common drinks of the time was flip, which was, I've always loved the idea of flip because they mix up the ingredients and then it would be a warm drink, and they'd warm it up by sticking a red-hot poker into it. That's what you did before you had microwaves. Weatherburn's Tavern was second in importance only to the Raleigh, and this is an original building which has been in continuous use as a tavern, store, home, girls' school, and guest house before it was restored as a tavern. Here is a picture of the great room in Weatherburn's Tavern. Interestingly enough, at the time, taverns were required by law to offer food and drink to guests at specified hours and specified prices. Here's a restored bedroom in Weatherburn's Tavern. As you can see, people lived in comfort at the time. We've got American post beds here with typical period hangings. The George Wythe House was built in the 1750s and belonged to George Wythe, who was a teacher at the College of William Mary, and he was one of the best lawyers, scholars, and teachers in colonial America, and among his students were Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall. And I want to talk about this house as an example of Georgian architecture. And when I refer to the Georgian era, I'm referring to King George II of England, not the later King George III, who was the Mad King George associated with the Revolutionary War. One of the first things I would point out is the facade, that is the front of the house. The breadth of it is twice the height, and that ratio of 1 to 2 is typical. This kind of roof is called a hip roof, also typical of the time. Balance and symmetry are important in this kind of home. Notice how if we were to divide it in half, that both sides are virtual mirror images of each other. Not only that, but the upper story, the windows line up exactly, and although the upper windows are a little bit smaller to maintain a harmonious look, they're lined up and they're the same kinds of windows exactly. This kind of house was a 4-on-4 house, that is 4 rooms upstairs, 4 rooms downstairs, and each of those rooms would have had a fireplace that went into one of these central chimneys here. While the house isn't particularly fancy to look at on the outside, it was built for harmony, balance, comfort, symmetry, and would be a pleasant place to live. Behind the house would be all of the buildings associated with making it run. They would include things like a smokehouse, a kitchen, laundry, a poultry house, a lumber house, a well, dovecot, a stable, and gardens. Georgian rooms are handsome and comfortable and opulently furnished. Notice, for instance, the fireplace, which would be imported marble, the oriental rug, silk hangings, fine china, beautiful woodworking. Here's a view of the parlor. If anything, this room is a little plain. Often the walls were painted in bright colors or would have silk wallpaper. Market Square sits halfway between the Capitol and the College of William and Mary, and it was the town square. The original charter from the town from George I set Wednesdays and Saturdays as market days. Think of them as more vital, more essential farmers' markets where people could get anything they needed: cattle, food, provisions, goods, wares, merchandises, whatever they needed to trade. Just off of Market Square is the public jail. What we see in this picture are the pillory and the stockades, which were punishments for relatively minor offenses. It would include things like treason, sedition, arson, blasphemy, witchcraft, wife-beating, cheating, drunkenness, things like that. Notice as well that a common punishment was to brand people. This is a T for thief, and people would be branded in an obvious place: hands, cheeks, shoulders, foreheads, something that would be very public and visible. The jail cells inside contained debtors, runaway slaves, pirates, the mentally ill, spies, military prisoners, deserters, traitors. Anyone would be held in these cells. They weren't meant for long-term confinement, but just as a staging area until the court sat. This is also a time and place where public hangings would have taken place. Here's an example of a debtor's cell, and actually this was much more comfortable than the cells that would be provided to criminals. Debtors at least had some straw, some furniture, and a resting place. Criminals were shackled. The Bruton Parish Church has been in continuous use since it was built in 1715. Originally, it was Church of England, now Episcopalian. It was the official court church of the colony. In other words, the law required all office holders to conform to established church. The interior of the church shows some of the same class distinctions that we see today at large sporting arenas. That is, the wealthy people get the boxes. The pastor would come up here to give his sermon. The governor would sit under this canopy on a chair right here, and notice the line of sight between the two most important men in the building. The magazine was originally built in 1715 to house the arms and ammunition which were dispatched from the Tower of London by Queen Anne for the defense of the royal colony. After the Revolution, the building was later used as a marketplace, a Baptist meeting house, a dancing school, and a livery stable. During the Civil War, Confederates used it for powder storage. Here's a view of gun storage inside. Interestingly enough, guns at the time were kept in a central place rather than individual homes. And notice that these characters here are wearing the uniform of the 1st Virginia Regiment. That was the unit that was organized and commanded by George Washington during the French and Indian War. The Wren Building is named for the famous architect Christopher Wren, who designed it. And this is where the College of William and Mary was housed. It's the oldest academic building in continuous use in English America. And William and Mary, which is still in existence today, is the second oldest college in the U.S. after Harvard. This great hall was for many years the main room of the college, and it also served as the first refectory, that is, where people went to dine formally dressed in their academic gowns. The common room was like the faculty lounge. It was for masters and professors only. Most of the faculty were Church of England priests, and the college expected them to remain unmarried and to live at the college. Here's a fine example of a private residence, the Brush Everard home. It was built originally in 1717 by John Brush, a gunsmith, but later it became the property of Thomas Everard, who was a mayor of Williamsburg. The way that it's been restored here is as Everard would have known it around 1773. Recently discovered wallpaper and paint help archaeologists continue to restore the house and make it more authentic. Notice once again, though, the outbuildings. The dining room in this house has been restored to represent the lifestyle of Thomas Everard, the mayor, and his daughters. This structure started life as a private residence, and it was occupied successively by a gentleman, a tailor, a blacksmith, a merchant, a spinster, and a wheelwright. But in 1766, Josiah Chowning opened it as a tavern. One of the interesting things about Williamsburg is you can go into many of these buildings and eat right there, because the foundation operates this today as an 18th century alehouse. The barber not only shaved men, he also offered his services as a wig maker and as a surgeon. For instance, here you see perukes. Here's a display of them in the window. Perukes were the little periwigs that men wore during the 17th and 18th century. So the barber used tools to fashion, curl, powder, and care for wigs. He also doubled as a minor surgeon, so the shop contained some dental and surgical instruments for bloodletting and things like that. You can walk in and the interpreters explain their crafts and demonstrate things throughout Williamsburg. I'm sorry to say that this is one of the few black people that you see in these slides because these slides are all older, but I noticed on my most recent trip to Williamsburg a couple of years ago that there's a real effort these days to incorporate the black and the slave experience and acknowledge its important place within the history of Virginia. The apothecary shop is synonymous with our modern drugstore. All of these Delftware jars that you see on the shelves would have been full of elixirs, ointments, perfume, tobacco, wares, aromatic spices, medicinal herbs, and the apothecary would also know how to use surgical instruments. So when you go into this house to visit, there's a full set of amputating instruments on display. In colonial America, the trade cabinet maker meant someone who produced fine furniture, not just ordinary cabinets. And by the late 17th century, the economy was good enough in this part of Virginia to support a full-time cabinet maker. By mid-18th century, only 1/3 of the fine furniture came from England because they were producing their own here. And many colonists thought it would be more patriotic to boycott English goods, and so they turned increasingly to homemade manufacture. Most Virginians preferred their furniture to be plain but neat, rather than the kind of elaborate Chippendale style that was popular in England at the time. Cabinet makers worked by natural light, so there was always lots of windows in these places. And notice that they produced harpsichords and things like that as well. A print shop at the time would not only print, but would serve as a stationer's, a post office, an advertising agency, an office supply store, a newsstand, and a bookbindery. So magazines, books, maps, almanacs, sealing wax, those kinds of things would be sold here. The printer would also print broadsides, business forms, laws, proclamations, blank record books, a number of things like that. This shop in Williamsburg published a weekly newspaper from 1736 to 1750, which is pretty notable because it was really labor-intensive to produce printing at this time. This man in the back, for instance, is the compositor. He's the one who set the type. And one page of a weekly newspaper would take 25 hours of hand labor. The process involved, first of all, composing the page, and then it would be locked into a framework and would be beaten. That's what this man is doing here, beating it with inked sheepskins. Then the pressman would pull on it. This wooden handle here, this wooden handle here, those are the pulls on the press. And it takes about 200 pounds of pressure to get an impression onto a sheet of paper. When they removed the pages from the press, they were hung up to dry. Each impression, each printed paper, would take about 15 seconds to produce. So you probably won't be surprised to find out that a typical workday lasted up to 14 hours for these fellows. The blacksmith was an essential trade in Williamsburg. They would produce agricultural tools, iron rims for wheels, repairs. They produced things for other trades too. They'd produce items for the miller, for the saddler, for the coachmaker, for the planter. And in houses, they would produce the fireplace racks, the endirons, the pot hooks, the locks, utensils, and any decorative wrought iron. This slide is actually a misrepresentation because producing cloth wasn't actually a trade at all. It was a domestic skill. All the spinning and weaving would take place in the home rather than being a commercial occupation. Almost every household would have equipment for spinning and weaving, but it wouldn't be centralized like this all in one place. Bakeries were another essential 18th century trade. These ovens were heated with fire inside, and then when the oven reached the right temperature, the baker would rake out the coals and insert the bakery goods with a long-handled wooden peel, and then remove them when they were done. The Robertson windmill was the domain of the miller and his assistant, and this particular kind of windmill is called a post mill. Do you see how the house sits upon a central post here? That's a design that first appeared in Europe in the Middle Ages. The man on the tail pole, and that's this item right here, would position the windmill's blades by moving it around. A shaft and gear arrangement turned the millstone. That would grind the corn into meal and the wheat into flour, and a sifting apparatus on the first floor fed the product into bags. Traditionally, the miller collected 1/6 of the weight that he milled, so that's how he got paid. Here's another important private residence. Peyton Randolph was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, and his house was in existence in 1715. Some of the famous people who stayed here were General Rochambeau and the Marquis de Lafayette. Notice, because things are continuing to change at Williamsburg, that this house originally started out being painted white. They did more archaeology, more work, and discovered that it was a deep red color. The James Getty House is a private residence with an adjoining shop. And notice that it starts off as a white color here, and then is later restored to more authentic colors here. We have two different perspectives here, looking from the shop side, and here looking more from the residence side. The house was a L-shaped house, and it was probably built that way because this was right on a corner. Even the gardens in Williamsburg are authentic, and they've been reconstructed based upon old drawings and sketches that the archaeologists have been able to find. This concludes our little tour of life and architecture in Williamsburg. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that someday you get a chance to visit Williamsburg and walk through these lovely gardens for yourself.